The year was 1923, and the vast Montana countryside stretched endlessly under a pale winter sky. Miles away from the nearest town, a small ranch sat nestled between rolling hills and dense pine forests. This was the Blackwood homestead, a place that had once known laughter and warmth, but now felt cold and empty despite the crackling fires that burned in its hearths. Silas Blackwood stood on his front porch, his weathered hands gripping the wooden railing as he stared out at his land. At 45, he was a man who had seen too much hardship in too few years. The lines on his face told stories of drought, harsh winters, and the constant struggle to make a living from the unforgiving earth. But it was the deeper lines, the ones that seemed carved by sorrow and something darker, that made neighbors uncomfortable when they looked into his eyes. The ranch itself was modest, but well built. A 2-story wooden house with a wide porch, a large red barn, and several smaller outbuildings scattered across the property. Cattle grazed in the distant pastures and chickens pecked around the yard near the kitchen door. It should have been a peaceful scene, the kind of place where a family could build a good life together. But peace had abandoned this place the day Helen Blackwood drew her last breath. Helen had been the heart of the ranch, the gentle soul who could calm her husband's storms and bring light to the darkest days. She had died just 3 months ago, taken by a fever that no amount of prayer or medicine could break. Since then, Silas had changed in ways that frightened everyone who knew him. The grief had twisted something inside him, turning his natural sternness into something much more dangerous. 10-year-old Timothy Blackwood sat in the barn, brushing the coat of the family's prized stallion. The horse was magnificent, standing, nearly 17 hands high with a coat as black as midnight and eyes that seemed to hold an almost human intelligence. His name was Thunder, and he had been with the family since Timothy was just 5 years old. The boy and the horse had grown up together, and in the months since his mother's death, Thunder had become Timothy's closest companion. "Easy, boy," Timothy whispered, running the brush along Thunder's powerful neck. The horse nickered softly, turning his great head to nuzzle the boy's shoulder. There was something comforting about the simple routine of caring for Thunder, something that helped Timothy forget, if only for a while, about the way his father had been acting lately. Silas had always been strict, but since Helen's death, his discipline had become harsh and unpredictable. The man who had once taught Timothy to ride and fish now seemed to see sin and disobedience in everything his son did. A dropped plate became evidence of carelessness that needed to be beaten out of him. A moment of daydreaming during Bible study was proof that the devil was working to corrupt his soul. The boy had learned to move quietly through the house, to keep his eyes down and speak only when spoken to. But even his best efforts couldn't always protect him from his father's rage. Just yesterday, Silas had struck him across the face for humming while doing his chores, declaring that such frivolity was inappropriate in a house of mourning. Thunder seemed to sense the boy's pain. Whenever Timothy came to the barn with new bruises or tear-stained cheeks, the great horse would lower his head and stand perfectly still, as if offering himself as a source of comfort. Sometimes Timothy would wrap his arms around Thunder's neck and cry silently into the horse's mane, pouring out his fear and loneliness to the only creature who seemed to understand. The ranch hands had noticed the change in their boss too. Jake Morrison, who had worked for the Blackwoods for 8 years, found himself walking on eggshells around Silas. The man who had once been fair, if demanding, now flew into rages over the smallest mistakes. 2 of the other hands had already quit, unable to tolerate the hostile atmosphere that had settled over the ranch like a dark cloud. "Something ain't right with him," Jake confided to his wife when he returned home each evening. "He's got that look in his eyes like he's seeing things that ain't there. And the way he talks about the boy." Jake would shake his head, unable to finish the thought. The nearest neighbors, the Hendersons, lived nearly 10 miles away. Mary Henderson had been Helen's closest friend, and she worried constantly about Timothy. She had tried to visit several times since the funeral, bringing food and offering to help with household tasks, but Silas had turned her away each time, claiming that he and his son needed to be left alone to grieve properly. "That man is going to hurt that child," Mary told her husband one evening as they sat by their own fire. I can see it in his eyes. When he looks at Timothy, it's like he blames the boy for something. Her husband, Robert, was a practical man who didn't like to interfere in other people's business, but even he had to admit that something seemed wrong at the Blackwood Ranch. Maybe the boy reminds him too much of Helen, he suggested. Sometimes, grief can make a man do things he wouldn't normally do. But Mary shook her head. This is different. This is dangerous. Back at the ranch, Timothy finished brushing Thunder and led him out to the pasture. The horse moved with the fluid grace of a creature born to run, but he stayed close to the fence line, never straying far from the barn where Timothy spent so much of his time. It was as if Thunder understood that the boy needed protection, even when they were apart. As Timothy walked back toward the house for supper, he could see his father through the kitchen window. Silas was reading from his Bible, his lips moving silently as his finger traced the words on the page. Since Helen's death, he had become obsessed with Scripture, spending hours each day reading and rereading passages about sin, punishment, and redemption. The Bible had always been important in the Blackwood household, but Helen had balanced her husband's rigid interpretation with gentleness and understanding. She had taught Timothy that God was loving and forgiving, that prayer was a comfort rather than a burden. But without her influence, Silas's faith had become something harsh and frightening. Timothy entered the kitchen quietly, hoping not to disturb his father's reading. He began setting the table for supper, moving carefully to avoid making any unnecessary noise. But despite his caution, he accidentally knocked over the salt shaker, sending white granules scattering across the wooden table. Silas looked up from his Bible, his eyes blazing with sudden anger. "Clumsy boy!" he shouted, rising from his chair. "Can't you do anything right? Your mother would be ashamed to see how careless you've become." Timothy quickly began sweeping up the salt with his hands, his small body trembling with fear. "I'm sorry, Papa. I didn't mean to." "Didn't mean to?" Silas grabbed his son's wrist, squeezing hard enough to leave marks. "The road to hell is paved with good intentions, boy. Your carelessness is a sign of the devil's influence. You need to learn discipline." He dragged Timothy to the woodshed behind the house, where he kept a leather strap hanging on a nail. The boy knew what was coming, but the anticipation was almost worse than the actual punishment. As the strap came down across his back again and again, Timothy bit his lip to keep from crying out. He had learned that making noise only made his father angrier. From the pasture, Thunder heard the commotion. The great horse lifted his head. His ears pricked forward as he listened to the sounds coming from behind the house. Something in those sounds made him uneasy, and he began pacing along the fence line, occasionally letting out a low whinny that seemed to carry both concern and warning. When the beating was over, Timothy stumbled back to the house, his shirt torn and his back on fire with pain. Silas followed behind him, breathing heavily from the exertion. "Maybe now you'll remember to be more careful," he said, settling back into his chair to continue reading. Timothy served supper in silence, his hands shaking as he ladled stew into his father's bowl. They ate without speaking, the only sounds the scraping of spoons against dishes and the occasional rustle of pages as Silas continued to read between bites. After supper, Timothy washed the dishes while his father retired to the sitting room with his Bible. The boy could hear him muttering to himself, occasionally raising his voice as if arguing with an invisible presence. Sometimes he would shout out passages about fire and brimstone, about the punishment that awaited sinners who refused to repent. When the dishes were clean and put away, Timothy crept out to the barn to check on Thunder one last time before bed. The horse was waiting for him as if he had known the boy would come. Timothy wrapped his arms around Thunder's neck, finally allowing the tears to fall. "I don't know what's wrong with him," Timothy whispered into the horse's mane. "He used to be different when Mama was alive. He used to smile sometimes. Now, he just gets angry about everything." Thunder stood perfectly still, occasionally nuzzling the boy's shoulder with his soft muzzle. There was something deeply comforting about the horse's presence, something that made Timothy feel less alone in the world. As winter deepened and the days grew shorter, Silas's behavior became even more erratic. He began speaking of visions and divine messages, claiming that God was speaking to him directly through the scriptures. He started staying up all night, reading by candlelight and scribbling notes in the margins of his Bible. Spring arrived late that year, creeping across the Montana landscape like a hesitant visitor unsure of its welcome. The snow that had blanketed the Blackwood Ranch for months began to melt, creating muddy streams that carved new paths down the hillsides. Birds returned to sing in the bare branches of the cottonwood trees, and the first green shoots pushed through the thawed earth near the barn. But inside the ranch house, no season could bring warmth to the growing chill that had settled over everything. Silas Blackwood had barely slept through the winter months, spending his nights hunched over his Bible, making strange marks and symbols in its margins. His eyes had taken on a wild, unfocused look, and he often seemed to be listening to voices that only he could hear. Timothy had grown thinner over the winter, partly from the poor meals he prepared for himself and his father, but mostly from the constant stress of living with a man who had become increasingly unpredictable. The boy had learned to recognize the signs that preceded his father's rages, the way Silas would drum his fingers on the table, the slight twitch in his left eye, the sudden stillness that would fall over him like a predator preparing to strike. The ranch hands had become nervous around their boss. Jake Morrison found himself making excuses to work in the far pastures, away from the main house. He had tried to engage Silas in conversation about the spring planting and the cattle, but the man seemed uninterested in the practical matters that had once consumed his attention. "He's talking to himself again," Jake told his wife one evening, standing out there in the yard at all hours having arguments with nobody, "and the things he says." Jake shuddered. "He keeps talking about cleansing and purification, about how fire is the only way to burn out sin." Thunder had become even more protective of Timothy as the weeks passed. The great black stallion would follow the boy wherever he went on the ranch, always keeping himself positioned between Timothy and any potential threat. When Silas would approach, Thunder's ears would flatten against his head, and a low rumble would emerge from deep in his chest. One particularly warm afternoon, in early April, Timothy was in the barn reading a book he had found in his mother's things. It was a collection of adventure stories, filled with tales of brave explorers and distant lands. For a few precious moments, Timothy could lose himself in these stories and forget about his troubled life. He was so absorbed in reading that he didn't hear his father's footsteps approaching the barn. Silas appeared in the doorway like a dark shadow, his face twisted with rage when he saw what his son was doing. "What is that?" Silas demanded, his voice cutting through the peaceful atmosphere of the barn like a blade. Timothy looked up, startled. "It's just a book, Papa. It was Mama's." "Give it to me." Silas strode forward and snatched the book from Timothy's hands. He flipped through the pages, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. Adventure stories. Tales of worldly pursuits and material desires. This is exactly the kind of poison that corrupts young minds. "But Papa, Mama used to read these stories to me." "Your mother is dead," Silas shouted, his voice echoing off the barn walls. "And these books, these lies and fantasies, they're part of what brought God's judgment down on this house. You should be reading scripture, not filling your head with worldly nonsense." He threw the book into a nearby water trough, where it landed with a splash and began to sink. Timothy watched in horror as the pages darkened and separated, one of his last connections, to his mother disappearing before his eyes. "I was just," Timothy began, but his father cut him off with a backhanded slap that sent the boy sprawling in the hay. "Don't you dare make excuses," Silas snarled. "I can see the devil's influence growing stronger in you every day. Your disobedience, your laziness, your preference for worldly entertainment over holy study. It all proves what I've suspected for months." Thunder, who had been grazing nearby, heard the commotion and came trotting toward the barn. When he saw Timothy on the ground and Silas standing over him with raised fist, the horse let out a loud whinny and moved quickly to position himself between father and son. "Get that animal away from here," Silas ordered, but Thunder held his ground, his dark eyes fixed on the man with unmistakable challenge. Silas had always been somewhat wary of Thunder. The horse was powerful and intelligent, and there was something in his gaze that made Silas uncomfortable. Now, seeing the way Thunder protected Timothy, Silas felt his anger shift to include the animal as well. "Even the beasts have been corrupted," he muttered. "This whole place reeks of sin and rebellion." Over the following days, Silas's behavior became even more erratic. He began conducting what he called purification rituals around the ranch, burning items that he claimed were tainted with evil influence. Timothy's few remaining toys went into the fire, along with his mother's books, her quilts, and even some of her clothes that Timothy had kept hidden in his room. Each burning session was accompanied by loud prayers and biblical quotations that Silas shouted at the sky. He would dance around the flames, his arms raised toward heaven, calling for divine intervention to cleanse his land of corruption. The boy watched these displays with growing horror, understanding that his father was slipping further away from reality with each passing day. Timothy began to seriously consider running away, but he was only 10 years old, and the nearest town was more than 20 miles away through rough country. Even if he could make the journey, he had nowhere to go and no money to support himself. Besides, he couldn't bring himself to leave Thunder. The horse had become more than just a companion. He was Timothy's protector and closest friend. The thought of abandoning the animal that had shown him such loyalty was unbearable. One evening, as Timothy was bringing Thunder in from the pasture, he overheard his father talking to himself in the kitchen. Silas was reading from the book of Genesis, specifically the story of Abraham and Isaac, but his interpretation of the tale was unlike anything Timothy had heard in church. Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son to prove his faith, Silas was saying to the empty room. He was prepared to spill Isaac's blood on the altar because God demanded it. That's true obedience. That's what separates the righteous from the wicked. Timothy felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in his father's tone, a kind of terrible excitement, that made the familiar story sound frightening and dangerous. As the days grew longer and warmer, Silas began constructing what he called an altar of purification behind the barn. He spent hours each day gathering stones and arranging them in a circle, muttering prayers and incantations as he worked. In the center of the circle, he erected a tall wooden post, explaining to anyone who would listen that it was designed to hold offerings for the fire. Jake Morrison watched these preparations with growing alarm. He had seen men lose their minds before, but there was something particularly disturbing about the methodical way Silas went about his work. It wasn't the random behavior of a man who had simply snapped. It was the careful planning of someone who believed he was following divine instructions. "I think we should contact the sheriff," Jake told his wife. "Or maybe the preacher from town. Somebody needs to know what's happening out here." But the nearest law enforcement was in Billings, a 2-day ride away, and the local preacher only visited the remote ranches once a month. By the time help could arrive, Jake feared it might be too late for whatever Silas was planning. Thunder seemed to sense the growing danger as well. The horse had always been alert and intelligent, but now he displayed behaviors that bordered on the supernatural. He would stand for hours watching the house, his ears constantly moving as he listened for sounds of trouble. When Timothy was inside doing chores, Thunder would pace the fence line, occasionally letting out long, mournful calls that seemed to echo across the valley like warnings. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in late April. Timothy had overslept, exhausted, from weeks of walking on eggshells around his increasingly unstable father. When he finally made it to the kitchen to start breakfast, he found Silas waiting for him with a strap in his hand and fury in his eyes. "Late again," Silas said quietly, but there was a dangerous edge to his voice that Timothy had learned to fear more than shouting. "Every day you prove my suspicions correct. Every day you show me how deeply the corruption has taken root." "I'm sorry, Papa. I'll make breakfast right now." "It's too late for apologies," Silas interrupted. "I've been patient. I've tried discipline and prayer and guidance. But nothing works because you don't want to be saved. You prefer your sin to salvation." He grabbed Timothy by the arm and dragged him outside, toward the stone circle he had built behind the barn. Timothy struggled, but his father's grip was iron strong, fueled by the manic energy that had been building in him for weeks. "You're going to help me demonstrate the power of purification," Silas said, his eyes bright with an unholy light. You're going to show the world what happens when we offer our most precious possessions to the flames of righteousness. Thunder heard Timothy's cries of fear and came galloping across the pasture. But the gate was latched, and the fence was too high for even his powerful legs to clear. The horse began running back and forth along the fence line, whinnying loudly, as he searched for a way to reach the boy who needed his help. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the Montana sky in shades of orange and purple that should have been beautiful, but instead felt ominous to young Timothy Blackwood. He had spent the day trying to stay out of his father's way, but there was nowhere to hide on the isolated ranch, and Silas had been watching him with an intensity that made the boy's skin crawl. All day long, Silas had been preparing for what he called the final purification. He had gathered more wood than usual, stacking it carefully around the wooden post in the center of his stone circle. He had cleaned and sharpened his knife, muttering prayers as he worked. Most disturbing of all, he had spent hours reading from his Bible, marking passages with a piece of charcoal and nodding to himself as if receiving confirmation from some invisible presence. Timothy had tried to focus on his regular chores, hoping that if he stayed busy and useful, his father might forget whatever terrible plan was forming in his fevered mind. But every time the boy looked up from feeding the chickens or cleaning the barn, he found Silas watching him with those wild, unfocused eyes that seemed to see things that weren't there. Thunder sensed the growing tension in the air. The great stallion had been restless all day, pacing in his pasture and occasionally letting out low whickers of concern. Several times he had approached the fence nearest to the house, standing with his head raised and his ears pricked forward as if listening for sounds of danger. As evening approached, Silas called Timothy into the house. The boy's stomach clenched with fear, but he had learned long ago that disobeying his father's summons only made things worse. He found Silas sitting at the kitchen table with his Bible open before him, a strange smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Sit down, son," Silas said, his voice unnaturally calm. "We need to talk about your eternal soul." Timothy perched nervously on the edge of a chair, his eyes darting toward the door. Something about his father's demeanor was different tonight, more dangerous than the explosive anger Timothy had grown accustomed to. This was the calm of a man who had made a terrible decision and found peace in it. "Do you know the story of Abraham and Isaac?" Silas asked, his finger tracing the words on the open page before him. "Yes, Papa," Timothy replied quietly. His mother had told him that story many times, emphasizing God's mercy in providing a ram for sacrifice instead of demanding Isaac's life. "Tell it to me," Silas commanded. Timothy swallowed hard. God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac to prove his faith. Abraham was willing to do it, but at the last moment, God provided a ram instead and spared Isaac's life. Silas shook his head slowly. "That's the version your mother told you, the weak sentimental interpretation that has corrupted the church, but I've received a clearer understanding through prayer and revelation." He leaned forward, his eyes bright with fanatic fervor. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac wasn't the test. The test was whether he would follow through, whether he would prove his faith with action rather than mere intention. God wanted that sacrifice, Timothy. He wanted the blood and the fire. Timothy felt his mouth go dry. "But Papa, the Bible says—" "The Bible says what weak men want it to say," Silas interrupted. "But God speaks directly to those who have the courage to listen, and He's been speaking to me for months, showing me what needs to be done to cleanse this house of corruption." He stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the stone circle he had built behind the barn. The wooden post stood silhouetted against the darkening sky like a grim sentinel. "Your mother's death was a warning," Silas continued, his voice taking on the sing-song quality of a preacher delivering a sermon. "God took her to show me that this family had strayed from righteousness. Her books, her gentle ways, her refusal to discipline you properly, it all led us down the path of sin." Timothy wanted to defend his mother's memory, to shout that she had been kind and loving and good, but the words stuck in his throat, choked off by fear of what his father might do if challenged. "Since her death, I've tried to guide you back to the path of righteousness. Silas went on. I've punished your disobedience, burned the corrupted possessions that led you astray, and prayed for your salvation. But nothing has worked. The devil's hold on you is too strong. He turned from the window to face his son, and Timothy saw something in his father's eyes that made his blood turn to ice. It was the look of a man who had moved beyond reason, beyond human emotion, into a realm of absolute certainty that admitted no doubt or mercy. There's only one way to save your soul now, Silas said softly. Only one way to burn out the corruption and send you to heaven clean and pure. Fire, Timothy. Holy fire that will purify your spirit and prove my faith at the same time. Timothy shot to his feet, his chair clattering backward. Papa, no, I haven't done anything wrong. I've tried to be good. I promise I'll do better. But Silas was already moving, his strong hands grasping his son's shoulders with bruising force. The time for promises is over. God has shown me what must be done, and I will not fail him as I failed your mother. He began dragging Timothy toward the door, ignoring the boy's struggles and pleas. Timothy fought with the desperate strength of a trapped animal, but he was only 10 years old. No match for a grown man driven by madness and religious fury. Please, Papa, please don't do this, Timothy cried, his voice breaking with terror. I'll read the Bible every day. I'll pray harder. I'll be the best son you could want. You'll be a perfect son once the fire has cleansed you, Silas replied, his voice eerily calm despite his son's hysteria. You'll be pure and sinless, worthy to stand before God without shame. They emerged from the house into the cool evening air. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. It should have been a peaceful scene, but Timothy felt as if he was being dragged into a nightmare from which there would be no awakening. Thunder heard the commotion and came galloping toward the fence, his powerful hooves thundering against the earth. When he saw Silas dragging Timothy toward the stone circle, the horse let out a sound unlike anything Timothy had ever heard from him before, a wild, challenging scream that seemed to echo off the mountains. Even the beasts rebel against God's will, Silas muttered, but he didn't slow his pace. If anything, Thunder's distress seemed to confirm his belief that demonic forces were at work, trying to prevent him from carrying out his divine mission. The stone circle lay in shadow, but Silas had prepared torches that cast flickering light over the scene. The wooden post stood in the center like an altar, surrounded by carefully arranged kindling and larger pieces of wood. Coils of rope lay nearby, ready to secure the offering that would soon be made to the flames. Timothy's legs gave out when he realized what was about to happen. His father's plan wasn't just some cruel punishment that would end with pain and tears. This was meant to be final, absolute, irreversible. Silas intended to tie him to that post and burn him alive. No, Timothy screamed, throwing himself backward with such force that he broke free from his father's grip for a moment. Somebody help me, please, somebody help. But there was no one to hear him except Thunder, who was now running frantically along the fence line, searching for a way to reach the boy he had sworn to protect. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and the ranch hands had gone home for the evening, unaware of the horror unfolding behind the barn. Silas caught Timothy again, this time wrapping his arm around the boy's waist and lifting him off the ground. Your screaming won't change anything, he said, his voice filled with terrible certainty. This is God's will, and it will be done. He carried his struggling son into the stone circle and forced him against the wooden post. Timothy fought with everything he had, but his small fists made no impression on his father's iron determination. Silas began wrapping the rope around Timothy's body, binding him securely to the post despite his desperate struggles. Don't be afraid, Silas said as he worked, his voice taking on an almost gentle tone that was somehow more terrifying than his anger had been. The fire will hurt only for a moment, and then you'll be free. Free from sin, free from corruption, free from the weight of earthly existence. Timothy's world had narrowed to this moment of absolute terror. The rope bit into his arms and chest, as his father pulled it tight. The smell of kerosene filled his nostrils as Silas poured the accelerant over the kindling. The flickering torchlight created dancing shadows that seemed to mock his desperate situation. "Mama," Timothy whispered, his voice barely audible above his father's continued prayers. "Mama, help me." But his mother was beyond hearing, beyond helping. There was only the madman who had once been his father, the pile of wood that would soon become his funeral pyre, and the terrible certainty that no human power could save him now. Silas stepped back to admire his work, the torch held high in his hand like a weapon of divine justice. Timothy was bound securely to the post, surrounded by carefully arranged fuel that would ensure a quick, hot fire. Everything was ready for the final act of purification. "Lord," Silas called out to the darkening sky, his voice carrying across the silent ranch, "accept this sacrifice as proof of my faith. Cleanse this child with your holy fire and welcome his purified soul into your presence." The match flared to life in Silas Blackwood's trembling hand, casting an orange glow across his gaunt face. For a moment he paused, the small flame dancing between his fingers as he stared down at his son bound to the wooden post. Timothy's eyes were squeezed shut, tears streaming down his cheeks as he whispered desperate prayers to a God he hoped was more merciful than his father had become. "Forgive me, Lord, for what I must do," Silas murmured, though there was no regret in his voice, only the terrible certainty of a man convinced he was carrying out divine will. "Accept this offering and cleanse this land of corruption." He began to lower the match toward the kerosene-soaked kindling, and Timothy's world seemed to slow to a crawl. He could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears, could smell the sharp odor of the accelerant, could feel the rough rope cutting into his skin as he strained against his bonds one final time. But then, cutting through the night air like a battle cry from another world, came a sound that made both father and son freeze in terror and hope. It was Thunder's voice, but not the gentle nickering Timothy was used to hearing. This was the scream of a stallion in full fury, a sound of such primal power that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The great black horse had found what he was looking for. At the far end of the pasture, where heavy rains had washed away part of the hillside, a section of fence had weakened. Thunder had discovered it during his frantic search for an escape route, and now he attacked that weakness with all the desperate strength in his powerful body. The fence posts were old and weathered, weakened by years of Montana winters. Under Thunder's assault, they began to splinter and crack. The horse reared up on his hind legs and brought his hooves down like sledgehammers, each blow sending vibrations through the ground that could be felt all the way to the stone circle. Silas heard the commotion but was too focused on his ritual to understand what it meant. He thought it was simply the horse's distress at witnessing the purification ceremony, proof that even animals could sense the presence of the divine. The match in his hand drew closer to the kindling, but Timothy understood. Even in his terror, he recognized the rhythm of Thunder's attack on the fence, the methodical destruction that spoke of intelligence and purpose, rather than mere panic. The horse wasn't just frightened, he was coming. With a final thunderous crack, the weakened fence gave way. Thunder burst through the gap like a force of nature unleashed, his black coat gleaming in the torchlight as he charged across the open ground toward the stone circle. His eyes blazed with a fury that seemed almost supernatural, and his hooves struck the earth with the rhythm of an approaching storm. Silas heard the pounding hoofbeats and looked up just as Thunder reached the edge of the circle. For one frozen moment, man and horse stared at each other across the flames of the torch. Silas saw his own death reflected in Thunder's dark eyes, and Thunder saw the madness that had consumed the man he had once respected. "Get back!" Silas shouted, waving the torch like a weapon. "This is God's work. You have no power here." But Thunder had moved beyond the reach of human commands. With a grace that seemed impossible for such a massive creature, he reared up on his hind legs, his front hooves cutting through the air like weapons forged by nature itself. When he came down, those hooves struck Silas squarely in the chest with a force that could crush stone. The impact sent Silas flying backward, the torch spinning from his hand to land harmlessly in the dirt several feet away. He hit the ground, hard, and lay still, stunned by the power of Thunder's attack. The match he had been holding scattered into harmless sparks that died in the cool evening air. Without pause, Thunder spun toward the wooden post where Timothy was bound. The horse's intelligence had always been remarkable, but now it seemed to transcend anything the boy had thought possible. Thunder studied the ropes for a moment, then began working at them with his teeth, his powerful jaws gripping and tearing at the bindings with surgical precision. "Thunder!" Timothy gasped, hardly daring to believe what was happening. "You came. You actually came." The horse's response was a gentle nicker, so different from his earlier battle cry that it seemed to come from an entirely different creature. His teeth worked at the ropes with incredible care, never once nipping Timothy's skin despite the urgency of his task. Strand by strand, the bindings began to part. Behind them, Silas was struggling to his feet, his chest aching from Thunder's devastating blow. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead where he had struck the ground, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. But the madness in his eyes had not diminished. If anything, it had grown stronger. "Demon!" he screamed, his voice cracking with rage. "I should have known you were in league with the devil. This proves everything I suspected." He lunged toward a pile of tools near the edge of the circle, his hand closing around the handle of a pitchfork. The sharp tines gleamed in the dim light as he raised the weapon above his head. Thunder sensed the renewed threat and wheeled to face Silas, placing his massive body between the madman and Timothy. The last of the ropes had finally parted, and Timothy tumbled free from the post, his legs weak from fear and relief. "Stay behind me," Thunder seemed to say with his positioning, though horses cannot speak. His ears were laid flat against his head, and his lips were pulled back to reveal teeth that could crush bone. Every line of his body spoke of a creature prepared to fight to the death for the innocent life he protected. Silas charged forward with the pitchfork, aiming for Thunder's exposed flank. But the horse was ready for him, with reflexes honed by years of avoiding predators and obstacles. Thunder sidestepped the attack and lashed out with his hind legs. His hooves caught Silas in the hip, spinning him around and sending him sprawling once again. The pitchfork went flying, its tines embedding themselves harmlessly in the wooden post that had so recently held Timothy prisoner. Silas tried to rise, but his injured hip wouldn't support his weight. He collapsed back to the ground, his face twisted with pain and fury. "This isn't over," he gasped, his voice barely audible. "God's will cannot be denied forever. The purification must happen, with or without your interference." But Thunder was no longer paying attention to the fallen man's ravings. He had turned back to Timothy, lowering his great head to nuzzle the boy's shoulder with infinite gentleness. The contrast between his fierce protection and his tender affection was striking. Here was a creature capable of terrible violence, when necessary, but whose true nature was one of love and loyalty. Timothy wrapped his arms around Thunder's neck, burying his face in the horse's mane as the full impact of what had almost happened crashed over him. He had been seconds away from a horrible death, saved only by the courage and intelligence of the animal who had become his dearest friend. "Thank you," he whispered into Thunder's ear. "Thank you for saving me." Thunder stood perfectly still, allowing the boy to cling to him for as long as needed. His ears moved constantly, alert for any sign that Silas might attempt another attack, but his attention was focused on comforting the traumatized child. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of approaching horses. Jake Morrison had been riding home late from town when he heard the commotion, Thunder's screams, Silas's shouts, and the general chaos of the battle. Concerned for Timothy's safety, he had turned back toward the ranch, bringing with him 2 other men who had been traveling the same road. They arrived to find a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Silas lay crumpled near the stone circle, muttering incoherently about divine missions and demonic interference. Timothy clung to Thunder's neck, his small body shaking with the aftermath of terror. The evidence of what had almost happened was scattered around them: the ropes, the kindling, the overturned torch. "Sweet Jesus," Jake breathed, taking in the full horror of the situation. He was really going to do it. He was going to burn his own son. One of the other men, a sheriff's deputy named Hawkins who had been returning from official business in town, immediately took charge of the scene. He approached Silas carefully, mindful of the man's unstable condition. "Silas Blackwood," he said, in a firm, authoritative voice. "You're under arrest for attempted murder." Silas looked up at him with wild, unfocused eyes. "You don't understand," he said, his voice taking on the pleading tone of a man desperate to explain himself. "It was God's will. He spoke to me directly, told me what had to be done. The boy was corrupted, possessed by demons. I was trying to save his soul." Deputy Hawkins had seen many disturbed individuals in his years of law enforcement, but the complete certainty in Silas's voice chilled him to the bone. This wasn't a man who had simply snapped under pressure. This was someone whose grip on reality had been completely severed. "We'll let the judge decide about that," Hawkins replied grimly. He turned to Jake Morrison. "Can you help me get him secured? And someone needs to tend to the boy." Jake approached Timothy and Thunder cautiously, aware that the horse was still on high alert and might view any stranger as a potential threat. But Thunder seemed to recognize that these men meant no harm. He allowed Jake to kneel beside Timothy, though he kept his body positioned protectively nearby. The courthouse in Billings had never seen a case quite like the one that came before Judge William Crawford on a crisp morning in late May 1923. Word of what had happened at the Blackwood Ranch had spread throughout the territory, and the courtroom was packed with curious onlookers, reporters, and concerned citizens who could hardly believe the story they had heard. Silas Blackwood sat in the defendant's chair, his once proud bearing now replaced by the vacant stare of a man whose mind had completely abandoned reality. He had spent the past month in the county jail, where his condition had only worsened. He spoke constantly of divine visions and holy missions, apparently convinced that his arrest was simply another test of his faith. Deputy Hawkins had compiled a thorough report of the incident, interviewing everyone who had witnessed the aftermath of that terrible night. Jake Morrison and the other ranch hands provided testimony about Silas's increasingly erratic behavior in the months following his wife's death. The physical evidence spoke for itself. The stone circle, the wooden post, the ropes and kerosene that had been intended for a horrific purpose. But the most compelling testimony came from Timothy himself. The boy had been staying with the Henderson family since that night, slowly recovering from the trauma of his near-death experience. When called to testify, he spoke clearly and simply about his father's transformation from a stern but caring man into something unrecognizable and dangerous. "He wasn't my papa anymore," Timothy said, his young voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "Not after Mama died. It was like something else had taken over his body, something that wanted to hurt me." Judge Crawford, a man known for his fairness and wisdom, listened carefully to every word. He had presided over many difficult cases in his 30 years on the bench, but the attempted murder of a child by his own father was almost beyond comprehension. The defense attorney, a young lawyer appointed by the court, tried to argue that Silas was mentally incompetent and therefore not responsible for his actions, but the evidence suggested otherwise. The careful planning, the methodical preparation, the clear intent to carry out what he believed to be a divine command. This wasn't the random violence of a madman, but the calculated actions of someone who had chosen to follow a terrible path. When Silas was given the opportunity to speak in his own defense, his words only confirmed the depth of his delusion. He stood before the court and delivered what amounted to a sermon, explaining in detail how God had spoken to him directly and commanded the sacrifice of his son. He showed no remorse, no recognition that his actions had been wrong, and no awareness that he had nearly murdered an innocent child. "The boy was corrupted," Silas declared, his eyes bright with fanatic fervor. "I was chosen to purify him with holy fire, to send his soul to heaven clean and sinless. If that horse hadn't interfered with God's will, the ritual would have been completed as commanded." Judge Crawford had heard enough. After conferring with medical experts who had examined Silas, he rendered his verdict. The defendant was found guilty of attempted murder and conspiracy to commit murder. However, due to his clearly disturbed mental state, he would be sentenced to life imprisonment in the state asylum for the criminally insane, where he would receive whatever treatment was available for his condition. As the bailiff led Silas away, still muttering about divine missions and failed purifications, Timothy felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The man being taken to prison was his father, the person who had once taught him to ride and fish and fix broken tools. But that father had died along with Timothy's mother, leaving behind only a dangerous stranger wearing a familiar face. The question of Timothy's future had been the subject of much discussion among the adults responsible for his care. He had no other immediate family, and the ranch where he had grown up would have to be sold to pay for legal expenses and his ongoing support. Several families in the area had offered to take him in, but Timothy had one request that he refused to compromise on. "I won't go anywhere without Thunder," he said firmly when the Hendersons first broached the subject of adoption. "He saved my life. I won't abandon him now." Mary Henderson, who had become deeply attached to the brave boy during his stay with her family, understood completely. She had witnessed the bond between Timothy and the great stallion, had seen how Thunder watched over him with protective devotion that bordered on the supernatural. "Of course Thunder will come with you," she assured him. "Any family that takes you in will have to accept both of you as a package deal." In the end, it was Timothy's Aunt Catherine who provided the solution. Helen Blackwood's sister lived on a small farm in the next county, and she had been devastated to learn of her brother-in-law's madness and her nephew's narrow escape from death. Catherine was a widow herself, with grown children who had moved to distant cities, and she welcomed the opportunity to provide Timothy with a loving home. "I should have intervened sooner," she told the court during the custody proceedings. "I knew Silas was struggling after Helen's death, but I never imagined he would become dangerous to Timothy. I won't make that mistake again." The transition to his new home was not easy for Timothy. He had nightmares for months, waking up in terror from dreams where his father's torch found its mark and the flames consumed everything he loved. Catherine was patient and understanding, sitting with him during the worst nights and helping him process the trauma he had endured. Thunder seemed to understand that his young friend was struggling. The horse stayed close to the farmhouse during those difficult early months, never straying far from wherever Timothy happened to be. When the boy went to school, Thunder would wait by the fence until he returned. When Timothy did his chores, Thunder followed along like a loyal guardian. The other children at school had heard the story, of course. In a small community like theirs, such dramatic events became the stuff of legend almost immediately. Some of the children stared at Timothy with a mixture of awe and pity, while others seemed afraid to get too close, as if his misfortune might somehow be contagious. But there were also those who recognized Timothy's courage and resilience. A girl named Beth Parker, whose family ran the general store in town, became his first real friend in his new life. She wasn't impressed by the dramatic story of his rescue. She was more interested in the quiet, thoughtful boy who treated his horse with such obvious love and respect. "Thunder's special, isn't he?" she said one afternoon as they watched the great stallion graze in Catherine's pasture. "I mean, more special than other horses." Timothy nodded, absently running his hand along Thunder's neck. "He understands things," he said simply. "Sometimes I think he knows what I'm thinking before I do." As the months passed, Timothy began to heal from his traumatic experience. The nightmares became less frequent, and he started to smile more often. Catherine encouraged him to talk about his mother, sharing her own memories of Helen's kindness and gentle spirit. Gradually, Timothy was able to separate his good memories of his father from the horror of that final night. School became easier, as he proved himself to be a bright, hard-working student. His teacher, Miss Roberts, was particularly impressed by his essays about animal behavior and care. Timothy had developed an almost mystical understanding of horses and other farm animals, as if his experience with Thunder had opened doorways to communication that most people never discovered. When Timothy turned 13, Catherine gave him a special birthday present, a small colt that had been born on a neighboring farm. "Thunder's getting older," she explained. "Someday you'll need another horse, and it's never too early to start training one properly." Timothy named the colt Storm, and under Thunder's watchful supervision, he began teaching the young horse everything he had learned about trust, loyalty, and the special bond that could exist between human and animal. Thunder seemed to approve of the arrangement. taking on the role of mentor to both boy and colt with characteristic wisdom and patience. As Timothy grew into young adulthood, he never forgot the lesson Thunder had taught him on that terrible night. That love and loyalty could overcome even the darkest evil. That courage came in many forms, and that sometimes salvation arrived on four legs with a heart full of devotion. He decided early on that he wanted to become a veterinarian, inspired by his deep connection with Thunder and his growing understanding of animal behavior. Catherine supported his ambition wholeheartedly, working extra hours at her seamstress business to save money for his education. "Your mother would be so proud," she told him on the day he received his acceptance letter from veterinary college. "She always said you had a special gift with animals." Thunder was 23 years old when Timothy graduated from veterinary school, an advanced age for a horse, but still dignified and alert. The great stallion had watched over Timothy through his teenage years, his college studies, and his first steps into professional life. He had been friend, protector, and teacher, roles he had filled with the same quiet dedication he had shown on that night when everything depended on his courage. Timothy established his practice in a town not far from Catherine's farm, specializing in large animals and developing a reputation for his almost